I am Marcus, and I am 26 years old. Just a few short years ago, I sat in the painfully familiar living room of my childhood home and watched my parents do something so completely unhinged, so deeply twisted, that it shattered our family dynamic forever. My younger brother Julian had just been caught red-handed stealing $400 in cold, hard cash straight out of my wallet. I had the high-definition security camera footage to prove it. But instead of punishing him, instead of demanding he return the money I had worked so hard to earn, my parents sat me down, looked me dead in the eye, and told me that I was the one who needed to apologize to him. They said I was cruel for leaving temptation around while he was struggling with his path in life. They humiliated me in my own home, and Julian just sat there and smirked at me the entire time. But there is one massive thing they did not know. They had absolutely no idea that my late grandfather had secretly left a massive inheritance solely in my name, bypassing them entirely. They also did not know that my recent salary bump and accounting promotion gave me direct, unchecked control over the finances of the exact luxury Porsche and Ferrari dealership my father was desperately trying to do business with. And today, they are the ones crying, leaving voicemails, and begging for my help to save them from ruin. Before I tell you exactly how I systematically dismantled their golden child illusion and took back my life using nothing but the law and cold, hard boundaries, please hit that like button if you believe in true justice. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments down below. Now, let us go back to where this unbelievable nightmare really started. The air in that living room was thick, heavy with the suffocating smell of my mother's Sunday pot roast. It was a Sunday afternoon in late autumn, the kind of crisp, clear day that looks perfectly normal to anyone walking their dog past our house on the sidewalk. We lived in a quiet, aggressively manicured suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of neighborhood with strict HOA meetings, where people obsessed over the exact shade of their green lawns and neighbors secretly measured their personal worth by the brand of the luxury SUV parked in their driveway. My father, Richard, sat in his usual oversized leather recliner in the corner of the room. He always sat there like a king holding court, expecting everyone to orbit around his moods. My mother, Sylvia, sat on the very edge of the floral sofa, wringing her hands together so hard her knuckles were turning white, the way she always did whenever her picture-perfect family image was threatened by reality. Across from me was Julian. He was 23 at the time, wearing a faded vintage band t-shirt he had bought with money he did not earn. He was slouching deep into the sofa cushions with an air of absolute, untouchable arrogance. I had just shown them the video on my phone. It was the footage from the hallway security camera my dad had personally installed 2 months prior after some expensive packages went missing off the front porch. The infrared night vision video clearly showed Julian sneaking out of his bedroom, creeping down the hall, and slipping into my room at exactly 2 in the morning. He was in there for 30 seconds before emerging, rummaging through my jeans, and pulling out the $400 I had just withdrawn from the bank. That money was from my first real performance bonus at the accounting firm. It was meant to buy a brand new set of winter tires for my truck so I could drive safely through the upcoming blizzards. It was hard-earned money. It was my money. I sat there in the heavy silence, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I waited for my father, a man who constantly preached about hard work, traditional values, and strict discipline to everyone else, to finally hold his youngest son accountable. I watched my father's face closely. I saw the gears turning behind his eyes. He looked at the phone screen glowing brightly on the glass coffee table. He looked at Julian, who was casually picking at a loose thread on his jeans, completely unbothered. Then my father looked directly at me. He leaned forward, rested his heavy elbows on his knees, and let out a long theatrical sigh. He did not yell at Julian. He did not demand the money back. Instead, he told me that Julian was going through a remarkably tough time. He used those exact words. He said Julian was struggling to find his path in the real world and that his mental health was fragile. And then my father dropped the sentence that I will remember with crystal clarity for the rest of my life. He looked right into my eyes, his face completely devoid of sympathy, and said I was aggressively waving my financial success in my younger brother's face. He said that leaving cash on my dresser in my own private bedroom was exactly like leaving a raw, bloody steak in front of a starving dog and getting mad when the dog ate it. He actually compared my brother to a dog acting on pure, uncontrollable instinct, completely stripping Julian of any moral responsibility. He somehow miraculously spun the narrative so that I was the villain for being the victim of a felony theft in my own home. My mother chimed in right on cue, unable to let a moment pass without smoothing over Julian's crimes. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with that fake, overly concerned tone she usually reserved for church bake sales and neighborhood gossip. She said family protects family no matter what. She said I was being rigid, unfeeling, and completely lacking in basic human empathy. She told me that bringing up this accusation and demanding the money back was actively tearing the family apart. She said I was destroying a peaceful Sunday afternoon over a few meaningless pieces of paper. I looked at Julian. He was not looking down in shame. He was not avoiding my gaze like a normal, guilty person would. He was looking right at me. The corners of his mouth twitched upward into a clear, undeniable, deeply malicious smirk. It was the smirk of a criminal who had just watched the judge and jury hand him a full pardon while putting the victim in handcuffs. He knew he had won. He knew that in this house, under this roof, he was completely bulletproof. He could burn the entire house down to the foundation, and my mother would hand him the matches while my father blamed me for buying the gasoline. Then came the absolute ultimate disrespect. My father crossed his arms, puffed out his chest, and demanded that I apologize to Julian. He did not ask. He demanded. They wanted me to look at the person who robbed me in the middle of the night and say I was sorry for creating a hostile, unwelcoming environment. They wanted me to apologize for putting Julian in a position where he felt he had no choice but to steal. I did not scream. I did not flip the coffee table. I did not throw a punch. A strange, freezing cold clarity washed over my entire body. It felt like a heavy fog lifting from my brain after decades of being gaslit. I realized in that exact second that I had spent 26 years trying to win a game where the rules were aggressively rigged against me from the day I was born. I realized that they did not love me the way they loved him. They loved what I provided. They loved my silent compliance. They loved having a punching bag they could rely on to absorb all the family tension. I looked right at Julian. I matched his arrogant stare with absolute deadness in my eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke clearly and calmly, enunciating every single word. I said I was sorry for leaving temptation around. I promised it would never happen again. My parents immediately relaxed. My mother smiled a sickly sweet smile and said she knew I would do the right thing and be the bigger person. My father nodded approvingly, telling me that taking the high road builds character. They honestly thought I was submitting to their authority. They thought everything would just go back to normal, the $400 would be written off as a forced donation to the Julian Fund, and we would eat pot roast like a happy family. They had absolutely no idea that those were the last words I would ever speak as a resident of that toxic house. The storm had just started, the boundaries were being drawn in concrete, and they were completely unprepared for the reality check that was rapidly approaching. To truly understand the pure insanity of my parents justifying a theft and making me apologize to a thief, you have to understand the deeply twisted, deeply dysfunctional dynamic of our household. Growing up, there were two entirely distinct realities existing simultaneously under one roof. There was Julian's reality, and there was mine. They were two separate worlds, governed by completely different sets of laws, expectations, and consequences. I was the kid who did everything right, which in my family meant I was completely and utterly invisible. I got straight A's, stayed out of trouble, and never asked for anything. When I turned 15, I realized that if I wanted anything in life, I had to buy it myself. Asking my parents for money, even for a school field trip, always came with an agonizing lecture about financial responsibility, the value of a dollar, and how money does not grow on trees. So, I walked to the local hardware store and got a job stocking shelves. I worked every day after school and pulled double shifts on weekends. I vividly remember riding my bicycle in the freezing rain to work a Saturday morning shift, my hands going completely numb on the handlebars, just so I could save up for my own college fund. My parents never set up a savings account for me. They never contributed a single dime to my tuition. They firmly told me that building character meant paying my own way through life, and that hardship builds strong men. Julian's reality was a completely different universe. He was the charismatic one, the golden child, the boy who could do absolutely no wrong in the eyes of his mother. He could charm his way out of absolutely any consequence with a smile and a poorly constructed excuse. If I forgot to take out the trash on a Tuesday night, I was grounded for the entire weekend and lectured about my severe lack of contribution to the household. If Julian broke a neighbor's expensive glass window playing baseball in the street, my mother would rush to the kitchen, bake a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies, march over to the neighbor's house, and explain that Julian was simply expressing his youthful energy and creativity, and that boys will be boys. There is a long wall in their hallway leading up to the master bedroom. It is completely covered, top to bottom, in framed photos. I counted them once when I was a teenager feeling particularly bitter and unseen. There were exactly 32 pictures of Julian. Julian at his first baseball game holding a bat. Julian at his middle school graduation looking handsome. Julian holding a golden retriever puppy we did not even own. Out of all those frames, there were exactly 4 pictures of me on that entire wall, and 2 of them were blurry group shots from crowded Thanksgiving dinners where I was standing in the background next to the turkey. When I was 16, I bought a used gaming console with my own money from the hardware store. I worked for 4 grueling months to afford it. It was my most prized possession, my only escape from the constant favoritism. One afternoon, Julian got mad because he was losing a racing game on my console. In a sudden fit of pure, unbridled rage, he picked up the machine, raised it over his head, and threw it directly against the brick fireplace, shattering the plastic casing into a dozen jagged pieces. When my father got home from work, I expected Julian to face severe, undeniable punishment. Instead, my father pulled me aside into the kitchen. He told me that I needed to be a bigger person. He said material things did not matter, that electronics rot the brain anyway, and that getting angry at my brother would permanently damage our sibling relationship. I never got an apology from Julian. I never got a replacement console. I was just expected to absorb the financial loss and move on in complete silence. By the time I was 26, this disparity had become so massive it was almost comedic. I had put myself through community college, transferred to a state university, earned my degree in accounting, and landed a highly demanding job at a mid-sized financial firm in the city. I was working 50 to 60 hours a week, building my career from the ground up. I was still living at home, not because I wanted to be babied, but because the real estate market was absolutely brutal. Rent prices were skyrocketing, and I was desperately trying to build a solid emergency fund and a good credit score before signing a long-term lease. But living at home was not a free ride for me. On my 22nd birthday, my father handed me a printed rental agreement. He charged me $500 a month for my childhood bedroom. He said it was preparing me for the harsh realities of the real world. He said a grown man with a salary should not live for free under another man's roof. I paid it without missing a single month, transferring the money directly into his account. Julian, on the other hand, was 23 and had a completely different arrangement. He had dropped out of community college twice, claiming the professors were out to get him. He was currently unemployed and showed absolutely zero interest in finding a job. He spent 14 hours a day locked in his room, playing video games online with his friends, screaming at his monitor, and sleeping until noon. He did not pay a single dime in rent. He did not buy his own groceries. He regularly took my father's car out on weekends and brought it back on Sunday morning with an empty gas tank, fast food wrappers covering the floorboards, and mud on the tires. One evening at the dinner table, the tension finally boiled over, and I snapped. I brought up the rent issue. I asked plainly why I was handing over a large chunk of my hard-earned salary every single month while Julian lived a completely subsidized, consequence-free lifestyle. My mother immediately got intensely defensive. Her face flushed a deep red. She said Julian was highly sensitive. She claimed he was struggling with a heavy burden of social anxiety, and that putting financial pressure on him to find a job would mentally break him. My father slammed his heavy fist on the dining table, rattling the expensive silverware and the water glasses. He looked at me with pure, unfiltered contempt. He said Julian was still getting on his feet, navigating a tough economy. He said I was the responsible one, the strong one. He told me I should be grateful to God that I had the mental capacity to contribute to the household instead of keeping score like a petty, jealous child. Julian just sat there across the table, slowly chewing his mashed potatoes, a faint smile on his lips, completely unfazed by the argument happening over his head. The only person in my entire extended family who ever saw through this toxic, manipulative dynamic was my grandfather, Walt. Grandpa Walt was my father's dad. He was a retired, blue-collar electrician who lived about an hour out of town in a modest, sturdy house he had built with his own 2 hands. He was a man of very few words, but he noticed absolutely everything. While my parents fawned over Julian's loud personality and empty charm, Grandpa Walt would pull me aside. When we visited, he would take me into his dusty garage and teach me how to rebuild a carburetor, how to wire a ceiling fan, how to measure twice and cut once. He treated me with a quiet, steady respect. He was the one who told me to pursue accounting because he saw how meticulous I was. Grandpa Walt passed away when I was 24. His funeral was small, quiet, and deeply devastating for me. Afterward, my father acted as the executor of the estate. He gathered the family in our living room and announced that Grandpa Walt had very little left to his name. My father claimed the house had to be sold immediately to cover his final medical debts, outstanding property taxes, and the funeral costs. He said there was absolutely no money left over for anyone, not a single cent. I accepted it without a single question. I did not care about the inheritance. I just missed the only family member who actually looked at me and saw a human being worth knowing. I had absolutely no idea that my father was hiding a massive, highly illegal secret about that estate. A secret involving a specific legal document, a hidden bank account, and a lawyer who was about to blow my family's lies wide open. Living in that house felt like slowly suffocating in a room where all the oxygen was being pumped directly to Julian. I kept my head down, paid my rent, and focused entirely on my career. I was working aggressively toward my CPA license, studying late into the night until my eyes burned and the words blurred on the page. I naively thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved my worth and became wildly successful, my parents would eventually wake up, see my value, and treat me as an equal. I still desperately craved their approval. It is an incredibly hard habit to break when you are raised from birth to believe you are never quite enough. But that morning, the incident with the $400 completely severed that final, fraying thread of hope. It was the brutal, undeniable awakening I desperately needed to finally break free. It was a Friday evening in late October. The accounting firm had just closed a massive, grueling quarterly reporting cycle. We had been working 12-hour days for 3 straight weeks. My boss was thrilled with the spotless numbers and handed me a cash bonus in a crisp white envelope before I left the office. It was exactly $400 in crisp, brand new $100 bills straight from the bank. I was absolutely ecstatic. My old truck desperately needed new tires before the winter ice hit the roads, and this was exactly the amount I needed to cover the cost of the set and the installation. I came home exhausted but incredibly proud of what I had earned. I tossed my heavy leather wallet onto the dresser in my bedroom, took a hot shower to wash off the week, and immediately fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke up on Saturday morning, the sun was shining. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and opened my wallet to head to the tire shop downtown. The cash was gone. My heart dropped completely into my stomach. I checked the hidden pockets of the wallet. I checked the floor around the dresser. I tore my room apart, pulling the heavy blankets off the bed, shaking out my jeans, and checking inside my gym bag. The money had simply vanished into thin air. A cold, heavy pit formed in the center of my chest. I knew exactly who had taken it. Julian was the only other person in the house besides my sleeping parents. He had a long, thoroughly documented history of taking small amounts of loose change or $20 bills from my father's home office desk to buy fast food. My parents always brushed it off as borrowing. But $400 was incredibly bold. It was not borrowing. It was grand theft. I marched downstairs. My blood was boiling, thumping loudly in my ears. Julian was sitting at the kitchen island, casually pouring himself a massive bowl of sugary cereal, completely relaxed. I walked right up to him, planted both hands firmly on the granite counter, leaned in, and asked him exactly where my money was. He looked up, giving me that wide-eyed, perfectly innocent look he had weaponized over 2 decades of getting out of trouble. He swore on his life he had not even seen my wallet. He told me I was being paranoid. He said I probably dropped the cash at the bank or left it on the passenger seat of my truck. My mother walked into the kitchen in her silk bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, and immediately took his side without hearing a single detail. She scolded me harshly for accusing my brother without concrete proof. She said Julian would never do something so malicious to his own flesh and blood, and that I needed to stop treating him like a common criminal. That was the exact moment I remembered the camera. My dad had installed a small, discreet, motion-activated security camera at the end of the upstairs hallway a month prior. He put it up because some expensive Amazon packages had gone missing off the front porch, and he wanted to monitor the front door and the stairs from his phone. The camera pointed directly at the top of the stairs, perfectly catching the doorway to my bedroom in its wide-angle frame. I pulled out my phone, opened the security app, and rapidly scrubbed through the timeline footage from the previous night. I found it. The digital timestamp on the screen read, exactly 2:17 a.m. The grainy night vision footage caught Julian creeping out of his room. He looked left and right down the dark hallway, slipped quietly into my bedroom, and emerged exactly 30 seconds later, holding a thick stack of bills. He paused in the hallway, stuffed the money deep into the pocket of his gray sweatpants, and hurried back to his room, closing the door softly behind him. I slammed my phone down heavily on the kitchen counter, sliding it right in front of Julian's cereal bowl. I tapped play and turned the brightness to maximum. Julian's face went completely pale. All the color drained from his cheeks in a second. His metal spoon dropped into the bowl with a loud clatter, splashing milk onto the pristine granite counter. For a brief, glorious, terrifying second, I saw absolute, undeniable panic in his eyes. The golden child had been caught dead to rights with digital evidence he could not charm his way out of. My father heard the commotion from his office and came heavy-stepping down the wooden stairs. I shoved the phone directly in his face and made him watch the video twice. This was the moment. This was the moment I expected my father to finally snap. I expected him to grab Julian by the collar, march him to the nearest ATM, and demand the money back immediately, followed by an eviction notice. Instead, my father's face hardened. He did not look at Julian with anger or disappointment. He looked at me with deep annoyance. He told us all to go to the living room to discuss it calmly as a family. You already know what happened in that living room. You know they twisted reality into a pretzel to defend him. You know they made me apologize to the thief. But what I have not told you is the exact sequence of events I executed immediately after I spoke that fake, hollow apology. I stood up from the armchair. I did not say another single word. I did not argue, I did not cry, and I did not beg for them to finally see reason. I walked straight up the stairs, pulled 3 large canvas duffel bags from the top shelf of my closet, and started packing my entire life. I packed everything I owned of value. My clothes, my heavy winter coats, my books, my CPA study materials, my laptop, my important legal documents, my birth certificate. I moved methodically, folding shirts with absolute precision, my mind completely numb. My mother came up the stairs 20 minutes later, likely expecting to find me sulking in bed or crying out of frustration. When she saw the open bags, the empty closet hangers, and the stripped bedsheets, her face contorted in absolute confusion. She asked me what on earth I was doing. I looked at her, my face completely blank, and told her I was leaving. She laughed. It was a nervous, mocking, deeply condescending laugh. She told me to stop being so incredibly dramatic. She said I was throwing a childish temper tantrum over $400 measly. She said family is infinitely more important than a few pieces of paper, and that holding a grudge over money is toxic behavior. She told me I would not last a single month on my own because the real world is expensive, cold, and unforgiving, and I needed my father's subsidized rent to survive. I ignored her completely. I zipped up the first heavy duffel bag, walked right past her in the doorway without making eye contact, and carried it down the stairs and out to my truck in the driveway. My father met me at the bottom of the stairs when I came back inside for the second bag. He stood physically in my way, blocking the front door, crossing his large arms over his chest. He used his deep, stern, authoritative voice, the one that usually made me back down instantly when I was a teenager. He told me I was acting like a petulant child. He said if I walked out that front door over a minor misunderstanding, I was disrespecting the roof he so graciously put over my head, and I was breaking my mother's heart. I stopped. I looked at the man who had just compared me to a dog. I told him he did not have to worry about providing a roof for me anymore. I told him he could give my room to Julian so he would have more space to play video games and hide stolen cash. As I carried my final bag down the upstairs hallway, Julian was leaning casually against his bedroom doorframe. He had his phone in his hand, texting someone, completely unbothered by the fact that he was the catalyst for his brother moving out. He looked at me, gave a half-hearted, pathetic shrug and said, "Dude, it was $400. I was going to pay you back eventually." I stopped walking. I dropped the bag. I looked at my younger brother. I really looked at him. I searched for any shred of guilt, any trace of the little boy I used to protect from the neighborhood bullies, any sign of a conscience. I found absolutely nothing, just a hollow, entitled shell of a person. And in that moment, I realized I felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, no brotherly bond, just complete, icy indifference. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "No, you weren't." I picked up my bag, turned my back, walked out the front door, threw the bags into the bed of my truck, and never spent another night in that house again. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck in the driveway, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and called my coworker, Harrison. He had mentioned a few weeks prior that he had a small spare room in his apartment because his roommate broke the lease and moved out of state to avoid a bad breakup. I asked if the room was still available. He said yes, I could move in immediately. I drove straight to the ATM, pulled out my emergency savings, handed Harrison my half of the deposit in cash, and moved my bags into a room the size of a closet. In the span of exactly 4 hours, I had completely removed myself from my family's toxic ecosystem. I sat on my bare mattress, opened my laptop, changed my mailing address, updated my emergency contacts at the HR department at work to remove my parents, and blocked my parents' and brother's phone numbers. I needed absolute silence. I needed to build a massive fortress where their manipulation and financial abuse could not reach me ever again. The first few months living in Harrison's apartment were brutally difficult, both physically and financially. The place was incredibly small, located on the 3rd floor of an old building where the heating system barely worked during the bitter cold nights. My financial budget was stretched to the absolute limit. After paying my share of the rent, utilities, internet, and my aggressive student loan payments, I survived on heavily discounted canned soup, bulk bags of rice, and whatever free stale coffee I could drink in the break room at the office. But despite the physical discomfort, despite the freezing drafts from the window, I had never slept better in my entire life. There was no constant tension thick in the air. Nobody was demanding my money to cover their reckless mistakes. Nobody was constantly telling me I was ungrateful or selfish for wanting to keep the money I earned. I spent every single evening sitting at a tiny, wobbly folding table in the corner of my cramped bedroom, studying endlessly for my CPA exams. I poured every ounce of my frustration, every vivid memory of their disrespect, into those thick accounting textbooks. I channeled the blatant disrespect from my father, the smirk from my brother, into pure, unadulterated ambition. I was going to build a life so successful they could never touch me again. At the accounting firm, my focus became absolute and razor-sharp. My supervisor, Mrs. Harrington, was a tough, no-nonsense corporate woman in her 50s who expected absolute perfection from her team. She did not tolerate excuses, missed deadlines, or sloppy spreadsheets. Most of the junior accountants were terrified of her sharp critiques, but I thrived under her strict management. She evaluated me entirely on my professional merit, the accuracy of my financial models, and my relentless work ethic. She did not care about my personality, she did not care about my family background, and she certainly did not care about my ability to charm people. 6 months after I moved out of my parents' house, Mrs. Harrington called me into her corner office. She sat behind her massive mahogany desk, looked at my quarterly performance review, and told me I was producing the most accurate financial forecasting in the entire department. Without any hesitation, she promoted me to senior associate, complete with a massive salary bump. But the promotion came with a heavy challenge. She handed me the firm's most lucrative, prestigious, and notoriously difficult account, Mr. Beaumont. Mr. Beaumont owned a massive chain of luxury car dealerships across the state. His flagship showroom dealt exclusively in high-end luxury imports, specifically Porsche and Ferrari. He was a notoriously demanding client who fired accounting firms the way normal people change their socks. He required flawless inventory tracking for multimillion-dollar vehicles, incredibly complex tax strategies involving depreciation, and highly detailed payroll management for his top-tier sales executives. Mrs. Harrington trusted me to handle his entire portfolio on my own. I took over the account and immediately spent 3 weeks completely streamlining his financial reporting system. During my first deep forensic audit of his books, I caught a massive tax discrepancy regarding the importation fees and luxury taxes of the Ferrari units that saved his business tens of thousands of dollars in a single fiscal quarter. Mr. Beaumont was absolutely thrilled. He was a wealthy, powerful, intimidating man, but he respected hard work and competence above all else. He insisted on dealing directly with me from that point forward. My salary bumped up significantly again with the performance bonuses, and I finally had real, undeniable financial security. I could afford a better apartment, good food, and I started maxing out my 401k. During this time of massive professional growth, I also started dating a woman named Clara. She was an emergency room nurse who possessed the exact same quiet, unflinching strength I admired so much in my grandfather. She was used to dealing with chaos and trauma, so when I slowly opened up and explained my chaotic family history, she listened without an ounce of judgment. She didn't pity me. She respected me for leaving. She helped me fortify the boundaries I had set, constantly reminding me that I owed them nothing. Life was incredibly good. I was thriving in the silence and peace I had painstakingly built for myself. But the silence from my family did not last forever. About a month after I had moved out, the fragile house of cards my parents built around Julian started to completely and spectacularly collapse. It began when my mother called my work phone, effectively bypassing the block I had placed on my personal cell. I answered, assuming it was a vendor or a client calling the main line. Her voice was trembling uncontrollably. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if my new apartment was warm enough, or if I was eating well. She immediately launched into a frantic, hysterical story. My father kept a heavy, supposedly secure fireproof safe hidden in the floorboards of his home office closet. It was where he stored his emergency cash, passports, and important insurance documents. According to my mother, someone had somehow bypassed the digital combination lock. $6,000 in emergency cash was completely missing. She asked me, her voice high-pitched with panic, if I remembered the combination from when I lived there. She frantically floated absurd, impossible theories about the neighborhood lawn care guys sneaking through the back window, or the plumber who had come by 3 weeks ago somehow picking a digital lock. She was doing absolutely everything in her power to avoid stating the obvious truth that we both knew. Julian had struck again. I sat at my desk, looking out the large window of my office at the city skyline, and felt a dark, heavy wave of pure amusement wash over me. I asked her point-blank why she was calling me about this. I reminded her calmly that according to their exact logic from a month ago, leaving cash locked in a safe in your own home was basically just leaving temptation around for someone who was struggling. I asked her if she had sat down and apologized to the thief yet for creating a hostile environment. She went dead silent on the phone. Then she started crying hysterically, begging me to come over to the house and help my father figure out the damaged finances. She said my dad was losing his mind and they didn't know what to do. I told her I was incredibly busy working on a major tax audit for a Porsche dealership, wished her the best of luck with the police report, and hung up the phone. The chaos in their house only escalated from there. A few weeks later, my cousin Vincent, the only relative I still occasionally spoke to because he knew how insane my parents were, called me with an unbelievable update. Julian had apparently borrowed $3,000 in cash from a man named Floyd. Floyd was a sketchy business associate of my father who ran a local landscaping company and dabbled in some off-the-books lending. Julian had promised Floyd he could double the money in a ridiculous cryptocurrency day trading scheme he read about on Reddit. Of course, the golden child lost every single penny of it in less than 48 hours. Floyd did not care about Julian's excuses, his sensitive nature, or his delicate mental health. Floyd showed up at my parents' house on a quiet Tuesday night. He stood on the pristine, well-lit front porch, pounding on the front door with his fists, shouting profanities, and threatening to file a massive lawsuit or cause physical harm if he did not get his cash back immediately. My father, who was absolutely terrified of a public scandal in his pristine HOA neighborhood, had to empty his personal savings account, march out to the porch in his pajamas, and pay Floyd off right there in the dark. Between my stolen $400, the $6,000 vanished from the safe, and the $3,000 to pay off Floyd, Julian had burned through nearly $10,000 of family money in a matter of a few short months. And yet, unbelievably, my parents still refused to kick him out. They were drowning financially and emotionally, permanently handcuffed to the destructive, entitled monster they had created. I watched it all happen from a safe, comfortable distance, completely insulated from the toxic fallout. I was untouchable. I thought the worst of their drama was over, and that they would simply fade into the background of my new, highly successful life. I thought I had won the war simply by walking away. I was so incredibly wrong. The real betrayal, the massive, illegal secret my father had buried deep to protect his own ego and his favorite son, was about to be unearthed by a phone call from a lawyer I had never even met. A phone call that would change absolutely everything. I was sitting in my corner office on a gloomy, rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside the massive glass windows was the color of bruised iron, and the city traffic below was a slow, red-lit crawl. I was completely buried in a highly complex depreciation schedule for a brand new fleet of imported sports cars for my biggest client, Mr. Beaumont. I had my sleeves rolled up, a lukewarm cup of break-room coffee sitting on a coaster, and my mind entirely focused on corporate tax law. That was when my desk phone rang. It was an outside line, displaying a local area code but a number I absolutely did not recognize. I answered it with my standard, polished professional greeting, fully expecting a vendor, a junior associate from a partner firm, or perhaps a frustrated client with a missing invoice. Instead, a deep, gravelly, incredibly formal voice on the other end of the line asked to speak with Marcus. The man did not sound like a salesman. He sounded like a judge. He introduced himself as Arthur Caldwell. He was an estate and probate attorney operating out of a small but highly established, decades-old law firm located 2 towns over from where I grew up. I had never heard the name Arthur Caldwell in my entire life. I politely asked him what this phone call was regarding, assuming it was a misdial or a cold call for legal services. He paused for a moment. I could hear the distinct sound of heavy paper files shuffling in the background, the squeak of a leather office chair, and then he said he was calling regarding the legal estate of Walter, my late grandfather. My heart instantly skipped a beat, and my fingers froze hovering over my computer keyboard. Grandpa Walt had been dead for over 2 full years. His funeral was a distant, painful memory. According to my father, who had eagerly stepped up to act as the sole executor of the estate, absolutely everything had been completely settled and closed out. My father had stood in our living room, wearing his dark funeral suit, and declared that the modest house had been sold to a local developer to pay off a mountain of end-of-life medical debts. He claimed the old pickup truck had been scrapped for parts, and the incredibly meager bank accounts had been entirely drained just to cover the funeral costs and outstanding property taxes. I told Mr. Caldwell exactly that. I explained very clearly that my father had aggressively handled the probate process and that I was under the strict, absolute impression there were zero remaining assets to discuss. I told him he must be looking at an outdated file. Mr. Caldwell let out a dry, humorless chuckle that sent a sudden, sharp chill straight down my spine. He told me that my father's version of events was not exactly accurate. In fact, he implied it was a complete fabrication. He said that while the primary estate, the house and the tangible property, had indeed been settled informally by my father through the standard channels, Grandpa Walt had possessed a secondary, completely separate high-yield savings account held at a regional credit union. And much more importantly, Grandpa Walt had drafted a highly specific, legally binding addendum to his will regarding this exact, hidden account. He had filed it directly with Mr. Caldwell's office several years before his passing, with strict instructions on how it was to be handled. I stopped looking at my computer screens. The bustling noise of the accounting firm around me completely faded away into a dull hum. I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper, exactly how much money was sitting in that account. $42,000. I sat there stunned. It was not life-changing, buy a private island, lottery-winning money, but for a retired blue-collar electrician who drove the same truck for 20 years, it was a massive, monumental sum. It represented a lifetime of pinching pennies, skipping vacations, working overtime in the freezing cold, and saving quietly in the background. But the total amount was not the part that made my jaw drop and my stomach twist into knots. The true shock came when Mr. Caldwell explained the exact, unalterable distribution terms of the legal document. Grandpa Walt had legally mandated that the $42,000 be split precisely down the middle, exactly 50-50. Half of it was to go to his only son, my father, Richard. The other half, exactly $21,000, was designated specifically, by full legal name and social security number, to his oldest grandson, me, Marcus. There was absolutely no mention of Julian. Julian, the undisputed golden child. Julian, the boy who could do no wrong, who was constantly praised and coddled. Grandpa Walt had completely, intentionally, and legally excluded him from the inheritance. I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair, staring blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles above me. Grandpa Walt knew, even in his final years, sitting quietly in his worn armchair and observing our chaotic family dinners in absolute silence. He saw exactly what was happening. He saw how I was cast aside, ignored, and treated like an ATM, and he saw how Julian was aggressively enabled into becoming an entitled monster. Leaving that money specifically to me, bypassing the family trust entirely, was Grandpa Walt's final, undeniable way of saying, I see the truth. I see your hard work. I value you, and I am protecting you. But the earth-shattering revelations from Arthur Caldwell were far from over. I asked the lawyer a very logical question. Why was I only hearing about this right now, 2 full years after the funeral and the supposed closing of the estate? The phone line went completely quiet for a few long seconds. When Caldwell spoke again, his tone had shifted from standard professional courtesy to incredibly serious, grave legal warning. He explained that as the sworn executor of the estate, my father had a strict legal and fiduciary duty to notify all named beneficiaries and distribute the assets exactly according to the will. Instead, my father had attempted to completely hide the existence of the account. He had lied by omission to the probate court. According to Caldwell, my father had recently discovered the original account paperwork while going through some old locked boxes in his garage, realized he could not access the funds without the lawyer's authorization, and had marched into the law firm just 3 days ago. My father had sat in Caldwell's office, puffed up his chest, and aggressively demanded that the $21,000 designated strictly for me be legally reassigned and transferred to Julian. My father had brazenly lied directly to an officer of the court. He claimed I was financially unstable, that I was a drug addict, that I was maliciously estranged from the family, and that it was Grandpa Walt's true verbal intention, on his deathbed, to leave the money to the youngest grandson who was currently struggling with his mental health. When Mr. Caldwell firmly and professionally informed my father that altering a legally binding will postmortem, without the named beneficiary's explicit written consent, was completely illegal and constituted severe fraud. My father completely lost his temper. He threw a massive tantrum right there in the law office. He demanded the full $42,000 be released directly to him as the executor so he could distribute it, as he saw fit as the patriarch of the family. Mr. Caldwell flatly refused, immediately froze the account to prevent any unauthorized withdrawals, and spent the next 48 hours tracking down my current contact information and employer through public records to inform me of my legal rights. My own father had actively, maliciously, and illegally tried to steal my inheritance to fund my brother's reckless, destructive lifestyle. He was fully willing to commit blatant probate fraud, risk a lawsuit, and face potential disbarment of his own reputation, just to take money from the son he despised and hand it on a silver platter to the son who had just stolen thousands of dollars from his own safe. The level of betrayal was so deep, so profound, it transcended anger. It was pure, clinical sociopathy. I thanked Mr. Caldwell profusely, confirmed my secure mailing address so he could send the official disbursement and tax paperwork, and hung up the phone. I sat in my office for a full hour, watching the rain hit the glass. I did not feel angry. I did not want to cry. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute power. The truth was no longer a matter of family opinion. It was documented on legal paper. Exactly 2 days later, the trap was set by my parents. My phone buzzed on my desk. It was a text message from my mother. It was completely out of character. She used multiple exclamation points, heart emojis, and tried to manufacture a breezy, casual, loving tone that we had not shared since I was a small child. She formally invited me to a special Sunday dinner at the house. She said she was making her famous pot roast, my favorite meal. And then the massive, glowing hook. She claimed Julian had done a lot of deep soul searching over the past few months. She said he realized the massive pain and financial damage he had caused. He was going to therapy, and that he desperately wanted to look me in the eye and give me a sincere, heartfelt, face-to-face apology. I read the text message and actually laughed out loud in my empty apartment later that night. It was so incredibly transparent, it was almost insulting to my intelligence. My father had hit a massive brick wall with the estate lawyer. He realized he could not legally touch my half of the inheritance without my notarized signature. So they were quickly pivoting to Plan B, the emotional manipulation playbook. They were going to lure me back into the childhood home, feed me a warm home-cooked meal to trigger nostalgia, offer up a heavily scripted, tearful apology from the golden child, and then, right when my guard was down and my heart was soft, they were going to guilt-trip me into voluntarily signing over the $21,000 to save the family. I showed the text message to Clara while we were eating takeout Thai food on my living room floor. Clara read it, raised an eyebrow, and looked at me with deep concern in her eyes. Clara was an emergency room nurse. She dealt with manipulative drug seekers, hysterical families, and high-trauma situations every single day. She knew exactly how toxic my family was because she recognized the behavioral patterns. She asked me if I was actually going to go into the lion's den. She offered to come with me, to act as a physical buffer, to hold my hand under the table so they would not gang up on me and break my resolve. I smiled at her, took her hand, squeezed it gently, and told her I had to do this completely alone. I was not the same scared, desperate 26-year-old boy who had hurriedly packed his duffel bags and fled in the middle of the day. I was a senior associate accountant holding the financial keys to a multi-million-dollar luxury empire. I had an emergency fund, a brilliant and supportive partner, a stellar career, and the absolute, irrefutable truth on my side. I pulled out my phone and texted my mother back. I typed one single word, yes. I spent the entire weekend preparing mentally for the dinner. I did not rehearse a screaming match in the mirror. I did not prepare a long, emotional list of childhood grievances. I prepared like I was walking into a hostile corporate tax audit with a fraudulent client. I reviewed the facts. I mentally locked away all emotional variables. I was going to walk in there, let them play their entire hand, let them lay all their manipulative, deceitful cards on the table, and then, with absolute precision, I was going to burn their entire casino to the ground. I pulled my truck into the wide, paved driveway of my childhood home at exactly 5 o'clock on Sunday evening. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as the day I left it, perfectly preserved in its own superficial amber. The lawns were perfectly manicured to the exact millimeter demanded by the HOA. The autumn leaves were raked into neat, uniform piles by hired landscapers, and the facade of wealthy suburban perfection was firmly intact. I turned off the engine, gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white for just a brief second, took a deep breath of the crisp evening air, and walked up the concrete path to push open the heavy oak front door. The heavy, suffocating scent of roasted garlic, rosemary, and slow-cooked beef hit me instantly. It was a smell designed to trigger comfort, designed to make me feel like a child again. My mother was standing in the grand foyer, wearing a floral apron over a nice silk blouse. She rushed forward with wide eyes and wrapped her arms around my neck in a tight, desperate, dramatic hug. It felt completely and entirely unnatural. Her body was stiff. She kept saying loudly how wonderful it was to have her eldest boy back home under her roof, completely ignoring the absolute fact that she had mocked me relentlessly and laughed in my face the day I moved out. I pulled away gently and walked into the formal dining room. The table was set with the expensive good china, the polished silver cutlery they only brought out for major holidays, and heavy crystal water glasses. My father was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a crisp, ironed button-down shirt. He stood up, extended a stiff, formal hand, and offered a firm, businesslike handshake. He looked incredibly tired. The immense stress of Floyd's violent threats on the porch and the missing $6,000 from the safe had aged him 5 years in a few short months. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent. And then there was Julian. He was sitting across from my old designated chair. My mother had clearly dressed him for the occasion, like a toddler being prepped for picture day. He was wearing a clean, tucked-in polo shirt, his messy hair was actually combed back with gel, and he was sitting up completely straight instead of his usual arrogant slouch. The absolute theatricality of the entire scene was nauseating. It was a stage play, and they all knew their marks. We sat down. My mother frantically served the food, piling my plate high with extra potatoes and carrots, constantly chatting nervously about the changing weather, the annoying neighbors down the street, and absolutely everything except the massive, suffocating elephant standing in the middle of the room. We ate in agonizing, excruciating silence for about 10 full minutes. The tension was so thick, so heavy, you could carve it with a steak knife. I chewed my food slowly, making direct eye contact with each of them, letting them squirm in their own manufactured anxiety. Finally, my father cleared his throat loudly, set his heavy silver fork down on his porcelain plate with a clink, and looked directly at Julian. It was a clear, silent, rehearsed cue. The curtain was rising. The main act was beginning. Julian put his hands on his lap, looked down at the expensive tablecloth, and took a deep, shaky, highly theatrical breath. Then, he looked up at me with wide eyes that were perfectly trained to look deeply sorrowful and regretful. He launched into what was undeniably a heavily rehearsed, memorized speech. He said, "Marcus, I know I messed up really badly. I was in a really dark, confusing place back then. I shouldn't have taken that money from your wallet, and I am so incredibly, deeply sorry for violating your trust. I've been going through a lot of personal struggles, trying to find my purpose in this world, and I wasn't thinking straight. I'm actively trying to be a better man. I am looking into counseling, and I hope, deep down, you can find it in your heart to forgive me, so we can be brothers again." It was word perfect. The cadence was flawless. It hit every single psychological buzzword my mother loved to hear. But as I sat there, my mind perfectly calm, I noticed exactly what was completely missing from the grand apology. He did not mention the $6,000 he stole from my father's supposedly impenetrable floor safe. He did not mention the $3,000 he borrowed from a dangerous, threatening loan shark that nearly got my father physically assaulted on his own front porch. The apology was strictly, surgically contained to my $400, the only crime I had definitive, undeniable camera evidence of. I did not break eye contact with him. I did not smile. I did not offer a warm embrace. I simply nodded slowly, my face a mask of stone, and said, "Thank you, Julian. I hear your words." My mother absolutely beamed. The relief washed over her face like a tidal wave breaking on the shore. She reached across the wide table and squeezed my hand tightly. My father nodded approvingly, taking a long, relaxed sip of his ice water. Their shoulders dropped. They thought the hard part was over. They thought the bridge was successfully rebuilt. Then came the pivot right on schedule, executed with terrifying precision. My mother folded her hands elegantly on the table, leaning forward with a soft, pleading, vulnerable expression. "Marcus, honey," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness and maternal concern. "We've been doing a lot of deep thinking lately as a family. We received some highly surprising news this past week. Your grandfather Walter's lawyer called your father. It turns out, Walt left behind a small, forgotten savings account, and it was so incredibly generous of him to include you in the paperwork." She paused, letting the statement hang heavy in the air, carefully testing the waters to see if I knew the exact dollar amount or the specific terms of the will. I remained completely stone-faced, giving her absolutely nothing to work with. She swallowed hard and continued. "The thing is, Marcus, you are doing so incredibly well for yourself. We are so proud. You have that fancy new promotion at the firm, you have a lovely apartment, you are completely financially independent. Julian, on the other hand, is really trying to turn his life around after hitting rock bottom. He wants to enroll in an expensive technical certification program. He wants to get his own apartment and start completely fresh, away from bad influences. We thought maybe, as a family united in love, we could talk about utilizing that inheritance to help him get a fresh start. Just a portion of it, maybe $20,000, to cover his first and last month's rent, his tuition, and a reliable used car. It would mean the absolute world to your brother, and it is exactly what your grandfather would have wanted if he knew how much Julian was struggling today to be a better person." There it was, the grand finale, the true motive, the entire Sunday dinner, the expensive pot roast, the clean polo shirt, the fake, tearful apology. It was all a highly choreographed, disgusting production designed to soften my defenses and separate me from the $21,000 my grandfather specifically left to protect me from them. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs. I looked at my mother's desperate, hopeful eyes. I looked at my father's stern, expectant, demanding face. I looked at Julian, who was trying desperately to hide a glimmer of greedy anticipation behind his fake remorse. I spoke calmly, my voice completely devoid of any anger or emotion. It was the voice I used when explaining a tax penalty to a client. "No." The single syllable dropped onto the dining room table like a 10-ton lead weight. My mother's fake, hopeful smile instantly shattered into a million pieces. Her mouth fell open in genuine shock. My father's jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth might crack, a thick vein pulsing dangerously in his temple. Julian slouched back into his chair instantly, crossing his arms protectively, the remorse completely vanishing from his face. "Let me explain exactly what is going to happen," I said, leaning forward, resting my forearms on the table, claiming the physical space and the authority in the room. "Grandpa Walt left that money specifically to me. He did not leave it to the family trust. He did not leave it to be split among grandchildren. He did not leave it to Julian. He put my full legal name, Marcus, on the document. He made a deliberate, conscious, legally binding choice, and I am going to honor that choice. Because it is the absolute only time in my entire 26 years of existence that someone in this family made a decision that declared my worth over Julian's." My mother started to stammer, tears springing to her eyes, trying to interrupt with pleas about family loyalty. But I raised my hand and completely silenced her with a look. "Do you want to know why I think he left Julian absolutely nothing? It is not because he hated Julian. It is because he saw exactly what you two absolutely refused to see. Giving Julian money does not help him. It enables him, poisons him. Every single time Julian steals, breaks something, ruins an opportunity, or fails, and you aggressively cover for him financially and emotionally, he learns that there are zero consequences in life. You made me apologize for being the victim of a robbery in my own home. You let $6,000 vanish from your own safe and pretended it was a ghost because you were too cowardly to confront him. You paid off a violent loan shark on your front porch because Julian is a coward who borrows money he can't repay. That is nearly $10,000 flushed down the drain in under 6 months, and his behavior has not changed a single solitary bit. The room was dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the sound of my mother's ragged breathing. But that is not even the worst part, I continued, turning my gaze slowly and locking eyes directly with my father. The worst part of this entire charade is you, Dad. My father gripped the edges of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white. Watch your tone, Marcus. You are in my house, he warned, his voice a low, dangerous, trembling growl. I spoke with Arthur Caldwell on Tuesday afternoon, I said, dropping the lawyer's name like a live grenade. The name hit my father like a physical blow to the chest. All the color drained from his face instantly. He looked like he was going to be sick. I know absolutely everything, I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room. I know that you, as the sworn legal executor of the estate, illegally claimed there were no remaining assets when you sold the house. I know you tried to hide the credit union account from the probate court. And I know you sat in a lawyer's office 3 days ago and threw a temper tantrum, demanding he illegally rewrite a will to steal $21,000 from your eldest son to pay for your youngest son's criminal mistakes. My mother let out a small, horrified gasp. She looked at my father, her eyes wide with terror. My father was staring down at his plate, completely unable to make eye contact with anyone. He had been caught committing blatant fraud. I could report you to the state board, I stated coldly. I could have you investigated for a massive breach of fiduciary duty. You could face fines or worse, but I won't, because dealing with lawyers and courts means I would have to continue interacting with you, and I am officially permanently done doing that. I stood up slowly from the table, smoothing my jacket. But before I walked away, I had one final card to play. The kill shot I had been holding on to all evening. By the way, Dad, I said casually, tossing my cloth napkin onto my half-eaten plate of pot roast. I noticed the glossy corporate brochure for the new Porsche 911 sitting on the counter in the kitchen when I walked in. I know you've been trying desperately to secure a fleet maintenance and logistics contract with Mr. Beaumont's luxury dealerships for your company for the past 2 years. It's your dream contract. You should know that I was just promoted to senior associate at my firm. Mr. Beaumont is my personal, exclusive client. I manage his entire corporate tax portfolio. I personally audit and approve all of his vendor contracts. When he asks me in our meeting on Monday morning if he should sign a multi-year logistics deal with a man who commits probate fraud against his own flesh and blood, what do you think I am going to tell him? Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The silence that followed my final revelation was absolute, total, and completely suffocating. My mother was openly weeping now, holding her expensive cloth napkin over her mouth to muffle her sobs. Julian was staring blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed. The smirk was gone. The fake remorse was gone. He was finally realizing that the endless well of family money, the impenetrable shield of parental protection, had run completely bone dry. There was no one left to bail him out. I did not yell. I did not throw plates against the wall to make a dramatic exit. I did not demand an apology for the fraud. I simply pushed my chair neatly under the table, turned my back on the pristine, toxic dining room, and walked out the front door into the cool, crisp autumn night. I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove away from the suffocating manicured lawns, the strict HOA rules, and the house of lies. As I merged onto the busy highway, heading back toward the glowing lights of the city, I did not feel a sudden, cinematic burst of euphoria or triumph. I did not pump my fist in the air. Instead, I felt a deep, profound, bone-weary exhaustion, followed rapidly by the purest, cleanest sense of peace I had ever experienced in my 26 years of life. The massive, heavy, invisible chain that had been wrapped tightly around my chest since childhood was finally, permanently severed. I could breathe. I arrived back at my apartment an hour later. Clara was sitting on the sofa in her comfortable sweatpants, grading some complex nursing student exams with a red pen. She took one look at my face as I walked through the door, immediately set her papers aside, and walked quickly over to me. She did not bombard me with a million frantic questions. She did not ask for a dramatic play-by-play of the confrontation. She just wrapped her arms tightly around my neck and held me. I buried my face in her shoulder, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, and for the first time in over a decade, I let out a long, shaky breath and allowed myself to just be completely vulnerable. The adrenaline crashed, and I felt safe. She ordered a large pepperoni pizza, we put on a mindless comedy movie, and we sat on the couch in comfortable, healing silence. I realized in that quiet, drafty apartment, eating cheap pizza from a greasy cardboard box, that I was finally home. Family is not determined by shared genetics, a shared last name, or a sense of obligatory debt. Family is determined by mutual respect, unwavering support in the dark times, and the complete absence of manipulation. 3 months passed in a rapid blur of intense professional productivity and personal growth. I officially signed the dense legal paperwork with Arthur Caldwell, and the $21,000 from Grandpa Walt was deposited directly into my high-yield savings account without any further interference. I did not spend a single penny of it on luxury items or a vacation. I treated it as a sacred emergency fund, a financial fortress that guaranteed I would never, ever have to rely on anyone else for survival again. At work, my relationship with Mr. Beaumont flourished beyond my expectations. I streamlined his inventory taxes and payroll systems so effectively that he sent a glowing, highly influential letter of recommendation directly to the firm's senior partners. My career was on a vertical trajectory I could never have imagined while living in my childhood bedroom. And yes, my father's logistics company mysteriously lost the bid for the Beaumont contract. I didn't even have to say a negative word. Mr. Beaumont simply found a more reliable vendor with cleaner financials. As for my biological family, the dynamic had shifted seismically. I remained strictly low contact, speaking to them only on my precise, unyielding terms. One random Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text message from my father. It was incredibly brief, completely devoid of his usual commanding, arrogant tone. It just read, "Marcus, congratulations on the CPA results. I am proud of the man you have become." There were no manipulative demands attached, no requests for money, no fake apologies for the fraud, just 5 words of reluctant, defeated, unavoidable respect. I did not reply. I did not need to. I read it, acknowledged the monumental shift in power, and archived the message. Through my cousin Vincent, the family grapevine delivered the rest of the updates. Julian's absolute free ride had officially ended. With the threat of me exposing my father's probate fraud hanging constantly in the air like a guillotine, and the family finances severely depleted from paying off Floyd the loan shark, my parents finally stopped enabling him. The well was dry. Julian was forced, kicking and screaming, to get a minimum wage job working the grueling night shift at a massive Amazon distribution warehouse. He was spending 8 hours a day lifting heavy boxes, dealing with strict corporate quotas, and finally, brutally learning the value of a single dollar. He had not asked anyone for a loan in months because he knew the bank of mom and dad was permanently closed. But the most shocking piece of information came from my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's older sister, during a brief, unexpected holiday phone call. For years, I had agonized over why my mother defended Julian so blindly. I wondered why she was so incredibly subservient to my father, allowing him to dictate every single aspect of our lives while she played the nervous, anxious peacemaker. Aunt Beatrice, perhaps fueled by a glass of wine and family gossip, finally handed me the missing puzzle piece. She revealed a deeply buried family secret. Shortly after Julian was born, my mother had developed a severe, secret gambling addiction. She had spent days at local casinos, completely drained my parents' joint savings accounts, and accumulated a massive, crippling amount of secret credit card debt. My father had eventually discovered the massive betrayal, and it nearly destroyed their marriage. But instead of divorcing her, my father used his salary to pay off the debts and bailed her out of legal trouble. However, that financial rescue came with a permanent, unspoken, devastating contract. My father held that massive mistake over her head for decades. He used it as ultimate leverage to completely dominate the household. My mother's absolute subservience to him, her constant anxiety, was rooted in deep, unresolvable guilt and fear of abandonment. And her blind, toxic enabling of Julian? It was pure psychological projection. She looked at Julian, the screw-up, the boy who constantly made reckless financial mistakes, stole, and caused chaos, and she saw a direct reflection of her own past sins. Every time she violently defended Julian, every time she begged me to forgive his thefts, she was subconsciously begging for her own forgiveness from my father. She could not bear to see Julian punished or held accountable because it directly reminded her of the punishment she felt she deserved. Hearing that truth did not excuse the years of emotional abuse she put me through. It did not magically heal the scars of being told to apologize to the person who robbed me, but it provided a profound sense of closure. It allowed me to completely detach. Their toxicity was not about me being unlovable or unworthy. It was a complex, generational web of guilt, financial control, and psychological projection that I had simply been caught in. Once I understood the exact mechanics of the trap, I was finally free to walk away without looking back, leaving their ghosts behind. Today, as I sit here telling you this story, looking into this camera, my life looks entirely, fundamentally different than it did in that suffocating, tension-filled suburban living room. Clara and I moved out of Harrison's cramped, drafty third-floor apartment last year. We recently signed a lease on a beautiful, spacious townhome closer to the city center. We have a small, quiet backyard where we drink our coffee on Sunday mornings, surrounded by absolute, uninterrupted peace. Nobody is screaming about missing money. Nobody is demanding rent for a childhood bedroom while funding a criminal. The air in our home is light, filled with mutual respect, laughter, and genuine partnership. Professionally, the promotion to senior associate was just the beginning of my trajectory. Handling the Beaumont luxury dealership account with absolute precision opened corporate doors I never even knew existed. I am now managing a massive portfolio of high-net-worth clients, navigating highly complex corporate tax structures, and building a rock-solid reputation in the financial sector as someone who is meticulous, highly ethical, and completely unflappable under pressure. I learned exactly how to stand my ground in intimidating corporate boardrooms precisely because I was forced to stand my ground against my own toxic, manipulative father. The harsh, painful lessons of my youth, the constant need to protect myself, became the sharpest, most valuable tools in my professional arsenal. I still have the $21,000 sitting safely in a dedicated, high-yield investment account. I look at the growing balance every once in a while on my phone app, but I have never touched a single cent of the principal. It is not just money to me. It is a tangible, compounding reminder of Grandpa Walt. I often think about him, sitting quietly in his worn armchair during those loud, chaotic family Thanksgiving dinners, watching my parents completely ignore me while they showered Julian with unearned praise and expensive gifts. I used to wonder, with a lot of teenage bitterness, why Grandpa Walt never intervened directly. Why he never stood up, slammed his fist on the table, and yelled at my father to treat me better. But now, as an adult who has navigated the real world, I understand his quiet, strategic wisdom. He knew that arguing with a textbook narcissist is a completely pointless endeavor. He knew that my father was too deeply entrenched in his own massive ego, and my mother was too paralyzed by her past gambling guilt to ever actually change their behavior. So, Grandpa Walt did not waste his breath or his energy arguing with them. Instead, he quietly observed, he bided his time, and he used his final legal will to launch a precision strike that bypassed their control entirely. He reached beyond the grave to hand me the exact financial shield I needed to permanently break the cycle of abuse. He taught me the most valuable lesson I will ever learn in this life. You do not have to participate in every single argument you are invited to. You do not have to scream until your throat is raw just to be heard by people committed to misunderstanding you. My parents and I have settled into a very distant, highly regulated, low-contact relationship. My mother calls me exactly once every 2 weeks on a Sunday afternoon. The conversations are brief, strictly surface level, and heavily monitored by me. She asks about the weather, she asks if I am eating enough vegetables, and she updates me on mundane neighborhood gossip. The absolute, unbreakable rule, which I established the day I walked out of that dining room, is that Julian's name is never to be mentioned. If she brings up his warehouse job, his struggles, or any of his manufactured drama, I immediately, without warning, hang up the phone. It only took 2 disconnected calls for her to realize I was completely serious. She complies because she knows it is the only way she gets to speak to her eldest son. My father and I barely speak at all, and I am perfectly fine with that silence. He knows that I know exactly what he is capable of regarding the probate fraud, and that knowledge permanently strips him of all his false authority. As for Julian, he remains firmly blocked on my phone, my email, and all my social media accounts. I wish him no specific physical harm, but I absolutely refuse to allow his chaos to infect my hard-earned peace. He is fighting his own battles now in the real world, without the endless financial safety net of our parents, and that is exactly where he needs to be to finally grow up. If you are listening to this right now, and you are currently trapped in a family dynamic where you are the designated scapegoat, where your hard-earned achievements are minimized while the golden child's massive, destructive failures are aggressively protected and funded, I need you to hear this loud and clear. It is not your fault. You are not crazy, you are not overly sensitive, and it is absolutely not your job to fix them. You cannot heal a family that is deeply, fundamentally committed to maintaining its own toxic dysfunction. Do not waste your precious energy screaming into the void, trying to force them to see your worth. They see it. They just choose to aggressively suppress it because your independence threatens their absolute control. The absolute best revenge, the only true justice you will ever get, is to quietly pack your bags, build a life of radical, undeniable independence, and become completely untouchable. Build a fortress of financial and emotional stability so high, so strong, that their manipulative guilt trips and demands for money can never reach over the walls. Protect your peace at all costs because you are the only one who will. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever been the scapegoat, forced to draw a hard line in the sand and walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you? Share your story in the comments below. Reading your experiences reminds all of us that we are not alone in this difficult fight for boundaries and self-respect. And please, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, stay strong, protect your peace, and never ever apologize for defending yourself.